Good morning, everyone. My goodness, here we are another week, and things seem to have changed extraordinarily since we last met. This is being filmed at home. If you hear the sound of a turbine, it's not a plane landing, but the washing machine. But I'm here this morning wanting to deliver our Bible study for the midweek Bible study that we normally have together. Before doing that, I want to draw attention to the letter I sent. The last time I suggested that one way we could deal with being isolated and remote from each other was to contact one another by phone or email or Skype or whatever. Zoom is being mentioned a lot by various people. That would be really useful if you can download it and maybe contact friends. But I want to draw attention to another paragraph this time, and it's where I've written, Dedridge Baptist Church is not only a horizontal network of relationships, but a vertical one too. Can I therefore ask us all to think of 11 o'clock, 11 a.m. each day as a point when we will all turn together in prayer, even though we are apart. We can pray for the nation. We can pray for its battle with this terrible virus. We can pray that the Lord will use these difficult times to speak into the minds and hearts of people. And we can pray for each other as a church at Dedridge Baptist, that the Lord will use us still to witness to his love. So can I encourage you, 11 o'clock every day, we won't all be in the same room or building, but we will be together in prayer. And in a way that unites us or makes us conscious of our unity in Christ. I've come across a prayer that J. John has said he will use each day of this dreadful crisis. It's called Prayer for a Pandemic. So I'm going to pray now, and I'm going to use these words. May we who are merely inconvenienced remember those whose lives are at stake. And may we who have no risk factors remember those who are most vulnerable. And may we who have the luxury of working from home remember those who must choose between preserving their health or making their rent. May we who have the flexibility to care for our children when their schools close remember those who have no options. And dear Lord, may we who have to cancel our trips remember those who have no safe place to go at all. And Lord, may we who are losing our margin money in the tumult of the economic market remember those who have no margin at all. Lord, may we who settle in for a quarantine at home remember those who have no home. As fear grips our country, let all of us, Lord, choose love. During this time when we cannot physically wrap our arms around each other, let us yet find ways to be the loving embrace of God and Christ to all our neighbours. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, we turn now to our study, and it's in the Gospel of John. We've been looking at the resurrection in the Gospels. We've looked at the resurrection in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, often called the synoptic Gospels, because they see things from a similar perspective. They also have a relationship with each other, those three Gospels. There is a literary dependence amongst them. Mark appears to be the first one written, and Matthew and Luke definitely use a lot of Mark's material. We also know that Matthew and Luke use material they've sourced elsewhere, a resource we don't any longer have. Scholars refer to it as Q or Quell, which means in German source. And then, of course, Matthew and Luke also have material peculiar just to them. And so the synoptics are belonging to a family that see things the same way. When we get to John, things are very different. John wrote a lot later than the synoptic Gospels, and therefore his perspective is really quite unique. There are differences. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that he relied on sources that were dependable. And we'll see that now. I'm going to read from John chapter 20 and verses 1 to 9. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. And finally the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture, says John in a kind of parenthesis, that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Now, what an extraordinary passage. I have to say, it's my favourite on the resurrection. It has all the marks of an eyewitness testimony that John has recorded. But moving straight into our study, because we're trying to compare what we see in John with what we found in Matthew, Mark and Luke, you'll remember we used this document. We read those Gospels, as it were, in line. Today we're looking at all four in line again with John at the end, and you can get this paperwork when it's possible for me to give it out. I want to begin with a quote, though. "The two things which must be regarded as historically secure, according to Tom Wright, when we talk about the first Easter, are the emptiness of the tomb and the meetings with the risen Jesus. These two phenomena," says Tom Wright, "are firmly warranted." Now, as I've said, we've looked at the empty tomb in Matthew, Mark and Luke. Today we're going to look at it again, and we've just read about it. Now, what do we find? Well, there are 5 things I think are really useful for us to notice. Notice first, he starts like the others, telling us when it all happened. He begins, "It was early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb." There appears to be a divergence here with Mark, who says just after sunrise, when they were on their way to the tomb. And so it's only fair to admit there are divergences or apparent divergences, and of course that applies all across the Gospel accounts. Now, some feel these divergences call into question the credibility of the accounts, but that's not so. Firstly, in almost all cases, the divergences can be harmonized. John says here, while it was still dark, Mary went. He seems to be saying she set out, as it were, while it was still dark, while Mark records the women quite clearly on their way, maybe even just approaching the tomb. And so we can see this can be harmonized without any detriment or violence to the text. We need to remember too that the Gospels are oral testimonies recorded by the writers. Either they were eyewitnesses themselves or they recorded the accounts of other eyewitnesses, as Luke makes clear in the beginning of his Gospel. Check out Luke chapter 1, 1-4, to see the trouble that one Gospel writer went to see that all he said could be depended upon. But these Gospel accounts are accounts of what people remember, and we would therefore expect them to have divergences. In fact, to a degree, they authenticate what they wrote. If there were none, we'd probably think there'd been a tampering with the text. One scholar, Ed Sanders, puts it this way: calculated deception would have produced greater unanimity. And so therefore, when we notice these slight differences, we should look into them and then discover, in fact, that the whole account harmonizes wonderfully. It's not that each Gospel writer doesn't have his perspective, but when they're all brought together, we find those perspectives dovetail like jigsaw pieces in a jigsaw, creating this picture in total of the resurrection that is so convincing and so compelling. So there we have it. John starts like the others, telling us when it happened. Let's move on. This brings us to the next detail already hinted at, and that is the persons or the witnesses involved. In John, it seems we're confronted with a very lonely Mary Magdalene. And if you recall our study into the synoptics, each one has a collection of women. There's not a contradiction, but there are additions. For example, Luke mentions Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others. Again, it appears there's a divergence between John, certainly, and Luke. But is there a divergence? When Mary runs to tell Peter and the others, she says in verse 2 of this chapter in John, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." We don't know where they have put him. What we find here is that their divergence is capable of an explanation, and it adds, doesn't it, again, to the realism of the text. John isn't just parroting what he has read in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and surely he must have been familiar with them. No, he has sought out those who can share with him another fresh perspective on what originally happened. And then moving on, notice what we read of Peter and the other apostle in verses 5 and 6. It's quite extraordinary in its detail. First, notice that although the detail is extraordinary, it is almost incidental. Two set out, both run, and the other disciple outruns Peter. The first stops at the tomb entrance, but Peter, on arrival, runs straight in. I mean, you know, it's great to hear this. It's good to know that one of the disciples is a faster runner than the other. But why on earth do we have it other than that someone was speaking to John who had been either himself an eyewitness or had heard from an eyewitness as to what had happened? This is the kind of detail we put into accounts of just everyday situations and circumstances and happenings and events in life. But secondly, notice the way the introduction of Peter correlates with the young man's words to the women in Mark. It is to tell his disciples and Peter. And then Luke's comment that at the words of the women, Peter, feeling that they were confused, got up and ran to the tomb. So what we have in Luke, what we have hinted at in Mark, we find more fully given in John's account. And then thirdly, Peter in all four Gospels, as I'm sure we all know, is portrayed as an impetuous and an impulsive man. In fact, it's said of all Galileans. We find it referred to in other parts of literature. Josephus mentions Galileans as impulsive and impetuous, and certainly Peter was a man of his own area. That he ran straight into the tomb while the other behaved in a more guarded way is therefore entirely keeping with his personality profile. And so what we have here, it's incidental, it's interesting to read, but yet actually it fills out what we're already given to believe about this character Peter. Impetuous, impulsive, and so he runs straight on in. Notice next the witness to the cloths. And again, the detail here is remarkable. In verses 6 and 7, Peter saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. We read the cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Now there's a few matters just to think about. First, the account agrees with Luke 24 and 12, where Peter at the tomb bends over and sees the strips of linen lying by themselves. And secondly, the position of the cloths is suggestive, and every commentator mentions this. Burge writes that the facial cloth, which was really just a large handkerchief, was apparently wrapped under the chin and tied on the top of the head to keep the mouth from falling open. So when John says it was folded or rolled up, it was probably just there in an oval loop, as it would have been during the burial. The items are as well only just lying there, implying the location where Jesus had laid. Certainly, what they see here suggests a literal, physical coming back to life of the Lord, as though the Father, in raising him, raised him, and the cloths that bound him just gave way, as it were, and fell upon the slab where Christ had been lying. This is extraordinary. It's just, I suppose, as we'd expect it to be. And yet, as I've said, it connects with what Luke has been suggesting had happened. He bent over in Luke's account, sees the strips lying there, the strips of linen, but here in John it's more fully explained, and there's more visual detail. And so you can't help but feel this is the comments of an eyewitness. This is someone who has been talking with John and sharing either what they saw or what they heard another tell them they saw. But then moving on, we see that witnessing these things, the other disciple saw and believed. That is John's point in writing this gospel at all. In the last verse of this chapter, he writes, "These things are written or recorded, that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Wonderful account. But all these accounts are witnesses to not the capabilities of confused and overexcited religious imaginations, but something far more. And it's so important for you and I to get this as we approach Easter. Something else was shaping the narratives in these Gospels, and that was a personal encounter with a resurrected Jesus, a living Jesus who had died and was now alive. And the Gospel's witness to that is demonstrably rooted in history. Now, how amazing is that? I want us to reflect on this just for a moment. There is no other authority to which we can conceivably look that provides us with a hope and an anticipation of the future beyond death, other than this account of the literal, physical resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Nowhere else at all that we can look. We can ponder and we can reflect, we can come up with all sorts of religious ideas, but here, rooted in history, captured for us by 4 responsible gospel writers, we have the account of the resurrection, the literal, physical resurrection of the Son of God. And for you and I, that's incredible as we approach Easter, because we recognize that he was the first fruits, and all that believe will follow after. What has occurred for the Christ will occur for all those for whom he died and rose again. So therefore, as we approach Easter, then let us do so with joy in our hearts and real conviction in our singing and in our praises, because this Christ who has died is risen, and he did it for you and he did it for me. How wonderful. So therefore, get back into these gospel accounts of the resurrection. See the empty tomb, not as some small incidental detail, but taken together with the eyewitnesses who saw him and spoke of him. We have something so utterly wonderful. We have a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Thank you.